The silence was eerie. It was a quiet that no one at Graceland, the grand estate of Elvis Presley, had ever experienced. No music, no laughter, no bustling staff. Just the heavy, oppressive stillness that comes when the man who made the house come alive is gone. Dick Grob, Elvis's security chief, was the first to notice something was wrong. It was August 16, 1977, and Grob had been at Graceland for years. He knew the routines, the sounds, and the signs of trouble. But this time the silence was different. It was the silence of a house that had lost its heartbeat. Grob hurried to the second floor, where Elvis's private suite was located. The door was slightly ajar, and he pushed it open, his heart pounding. Inside, the bathroom was in disarray. The lights were on, but the room was empty. Grob's eyes scanned the space, and then he saw it. Elvis's body, lying on the cold, white tiles of the bathroom floor. Grob's mind raced. He called for help, and soon the house was filled with the chaos of emergency responders, but it was too late. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was gone. The news spread like wildfire. Reporters descended on Graceland, desperate for any detail. Two gawking journalists managed to slip past the security and into the morgue, where they witnessed hospital employees, wearing green coats with refrigeration technician, stitched on their breast pockets, wheeling Elvis's body away. Grob confronted them, his voice stern and commanding. "You have no business here," he barked. "Get out now." But the chaos didn't end there. Later that night, Grob faced another confrontation at the Memphis funeral home. A photographer was trying to capture the moment, and Grob had to persuade the police to double the security detail and keep the press at bay. He couldn't afford any more leaks. Back at Graceland, Grob was determined to uncover the truth. How could Elvis have lain on the bathroom floor for so long without anyone noticing? He suspected that Ginger Alden, Elvis's fiancée, knew more than she was letting on. He also wanted to speak to the maids, who might have noticed something unusual, like the buttons on the kitchen telephone console that lit up when calls were made from Elvis's bedroom suite. Grob also needed to talk to Elvis's stepbrothers, David and Ricky Stanley. They were supposed to be on duty, but David had left Graceland shortly after the ambulance arrived. Something didn't add up. Meanwhile, Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, was barely holding it together. His anger was directed at Dr. George Nishapoulos, Elvis's personal physician. Vernon blamed Dr. Nick for his son's death. He suspected the worst, maybe even poisoning. He signed the autopsy papers, hoping they would provide answers, but he wasn't waiting around. Vernon planned to confront Dr. Nick before the funeral and get some financial matters straightened out. In 1975, Dr. Nick had borrowed $200,000 from Elvis, and in March 1977, he borrowed another $55,000. The loans were for the construction of Dr. Nick's extravagant house in East Memphis. Elvis never signed the consolidation agreement, but Vernon did on the Thursday after Elvis's death. He fired Dr. Nick as his personal physician and warned him to never be late on the monthly payments. Vernon also ordered the Baptist Hospital officials to keep the autopsy results from Dr. Nick. He wanted to preserve the public image of Elvis as a clean-living entertainer who opposed drug abuse. To maintain appearances, he even allowed Dr. Nick to be a pallbearer at Elvis's funeral. Dr. Nick, sensing the tension, tried to smooth things over. He told Vernon a wild story about how Elvis had been suffering from incurable bone cancer and was in terrible pain. But there was no evidence to support this claim, and Vernon saw right through it. Dr. Nick's attempt at a cover-up didn't work. On the same day, Dr. Nick tried to file an official death certificate, listing cardiac arrhythmia, coronary artery disease, hypertension, and diabetes mellitus as the causes of death. The certificate was intercepted by the Tennessee Department of Public Health and sent to the medical examiner, who kept it secret and replaced it with his own. The cover-up was already in motion, and the truth about Elvis's death was being buried along with the king himself. As the news spread, the Memphis press was strangely tame. The lead story in the Memphis Commercial Appeal reported that Elvis had died of a heart attack. They quoted the medical examiner, who said there was no evidence of drug abuse, but the reporters didn't dig deeper. They were more interested in the fan response and the chaos outside Graceland. Ginger Alden, Elvis's fiancée, gave an interview to the Commercial Appeal, but she didn't mention any drug use. She spoke about how Elvis had proposed to her 2 months earlier, and how she found him lying on the bathroom floor. But her story didn't match the police report, which said Elvis's body was slumped to one side with his head against the wall. Dr. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner, took control of the investigation. He told reporters that the autopsy would take weeks to complete, and that there might never be a firm conclusion about how Elvis died. The press, cut off from hard news, focused on the mourning fans and the memories of those who knew Elvis. But beneath the surface, the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And as the world mourned the loss of a legend, a few determined individuals were about to start digging. The story of Elvis Presley's final days was far from over. The animosities were deep and long-lasting. The Commercial Appeal, a newspaper in Memphis, was known for its strong support of E.H. Boss Crump, a powerful political figure who ran the city like a benevolent dictator. This support meant that the newspaper had a lot of influence over what was reported, especially when it came to local celebrities like Elvis Presley. Elvis, being a local hero, benefited from this influence. If a police officer tried to give him a speeding ticket, it never made it to court. If a reporter at the Commercial Appeal wrote something negative about Elvis, the editor would quickly change it. For example, if a reporter called Elvis a pudgy reminder of the 1950s who ought to accept middle age, the editor would make sure those words never saw the light of day. When Elvis's health started to decline, the Commercial Appeal struggled to handle the news. The newspaper was off balance, with inexperienced editors and a lack of clear direction. Jim Kingsley, a reporter who had known the Presley family since Elvis was a child in Tupelo, Mississippi, was in charge of covering Elvis. Kingsley was a loyal friend to the Presleys and often protected Elvis from negative press. Kingsley's role was unique. He knew the Presleys well, having met them in Tupelo when Elvis was born. He followed them to Memphis when they moved there in 1948. Kingsley was content being a reporter, covering general assignments and writing about local events. He also had the Elvis beat, which meant he was the go-to person for any news about the star. If Elvis bought a new car or flew to Dallas for a special meal, Kingsley would get the call. He would then check with Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, to see if the story was true. Sometimes the story would be written, and sometimes it wouldn't, depending on Kingsley's judgment. However, over time, Kingsley became more protective of Elvis. He would sometimes lie to his editors about Elvis's health. For example, when Elvis was on tour in Las Vegas, Kingsley told the newspaper that a threat had been made on Elvis's life, but downplayed it. The night editor, however, saw it differently and wrote a story about increased security at the Hilton, where Elvis was performing. This story spread quickly, and even made it to the front page of the Vegas papers. As Elvis's health continued to decline, Kingsley's protectiveness grew. He would dodge questions from editors about Elvis's frequent hospitalizations and medical problems. William Sorrells, the managing editor of the Commercial Appeal in 1977, said that Kingsley would frankly lie to them. Sorrells and other editors tried to push Kingsley for more information, but Kingsley always managed to avoid giving them the details they needed. 2 weeks before Elvis's death, 3 of his former bodyguards, Delbert, Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, published a book called Elvis, What Happened. The book revealed that Elvis was heavily dependent on drugs. The Commercial Appeal, instead of investigating this independently, simply wrote a story about the book without a byline. The newspaper quoted Elvis's road manager, Joe Esposito, who denied that Elvis used drugs, calling the bodyguards very bitter. Bill E. Burke, a gossip columnist at the Press Scimitar, also covered Elvis. After Elvis's death, Burke wrote about his first meeting with Elvis and a psychic, who warned him that Elvis would die on tour. Burke also wrote about a letter he received from Graceland complaining about one of his columns. Burke's stories often focused on the positive aspects of Elvis's life, avoiding any negative details. When Elvis died, Beth Tamke, a medical reporter for the Commercial Appeal, was covering a meeting about selling cigarettes in hospitals. She had no idea what was happening until she got back to the office and heard the news. Tamke, known for her tough and thorough reporting, quickly realized that something was off with the information about Elvis's health. She started digging into the records of Elvis's previous hospitalizations and found inconsistencies. Her assignment became clear: get the autopsy report. Tamke's investigation led her to uncover evidence that suggested Elvis was a chronic drug abuser. However, her efforts to get the truth out were met with resistance. She was eventually transferred to a less important role at the newspaper, handling consumer complaints. Meanwhile, Dr. Harold Sexton, the pathologist at Baptist Hospital, was working on Elvis's autopsy. He sent a urine sample to the Duckworth Laboratory at Methodist Hospital for a preliminary drug screen. The results showed the presence of several depressants, but no amphetamines or cocaine. However, the lab at the University of Tennessee, where the main toxicology tests were conducted, reported different results. The UT lab found various drugs in Elvis's system, but did not find ethchlorovinol, a drug that the Duckworth lab had detected. Sexton suspected that the UT lab's technicians had burned off the ethchlorovinol during testing, leading to an accurate result. He and his colleagues decided to send samples to an independent lab in California, Bioscience Laboratories, for a more thorough analysis. This decision would later play a crucial role in understanding the cause of Elvis's death. Back at the commercial appeal, Beth Tamke continued to face challenges. Angus McEachran, the Metro editor, wanted the autopsy report quickly. McEachran was known for his ambitious nature and was soon to be transferred to another newspaper. He understood hard news and wanted Tamke to get the story. However, his replacement was more comfortable with feature stories that were less likely to cause controversy. As the investigation into Elvis's death continued, the tension between the need for truth and the desire to protect a local hero became more apparent. The commercial appeal, once a powerful voice in Memphis, found itself struggling to balance its loyalty to the Presley family with its duty to inform the public. Beth Tamke was under a lot of pressure. Her boss, McEachran, was always on her case, telling her she wasn't doing enough. But that pressure kept her mind sharp, and she was determined to get another story in the paper and find a way to get the scoop on Francisco. One day, she went to Dr. Muirhead, a pathologist, to tell him she was writing a story, but not about Elvis. Instead, she was focusing on pathology. Muirhead said she needed to read a book on the history of pathology. His secretary had to go all the way to his house to get it, and even got a speeding ticket on the way back. But Tamke read every word of that book, even though it gave her more information about pathology than she needed. Through this, Tamke got to know Dr. Muirhead better. She also met Dr. George C. Nishapoulos, known as Dr. Nick, but in a more challenging way. Dr. Nick wasn't returning her calls, so she decided to visit his clinic early one morning. When the receptionist told her she couldn't see Dr. Nick without an appointment, Tamke sat down in the waiting room and started reading a book about Elvis. She noticed that many young women were coming in without appointments to get refills on their medications. The receptionist, who was strict with Tamke, seemed to let these women in easily. After waiting for hours, Tamke finally got to see Dr. Nick. He gave her only 10 minutes, but she used that time wisely. She asked rapid-fire questions, using information from the Bodyguard book, and managed to get an exclusive story that appeared on the front page of the newspaper on August 25, 1977. Dr. Nick told her that Elvis didn't have a drug problem in the last 3 years of his life. He also mentioned that Elvis had been unhappy with Ginger Alden, and that he might have been dead for several hours before his body was found. Dr. Nick didn't believe Elvis had overdosed, but he did say that Elvis had taken some sleeping pills and had some medication for his colon and sinus. Tamke also reported on Elvis's blood pressure, which Dr. Nick described as sometimes very high and sometimes normal. She noted that normal blood pressure ranges from 100 to 150 systolic and 60 to 100 diastolic. A week later, the Memphis Press Scimitar, the city's afternoon paper, printed a weak follow-up story. The reporter, Peggy Birch, was having a tough time competing with Tamke. Birch, a Pennsylvanian with a 1960s Earth Mother look, found it hard to fit in with the conservative Memphis crowd. She was always one step behind Tamke. Tamke continued to follow up with her contacts and called the medical examiner's office. On August 26th, she got through to Francisco, who was sticking to his story that Elvis died of a heart attack. He mentioned that Elvis's heart was enlarged, his liver had fatty globules, and his coronary arteries were narrowed. However, Francisco misled Tamke about the stomach contents and the condition of Elvis's colon. He said the stomach contents showed nothing and the colon looked normal, even though that wasn't true. At the bottom of Tamke's story, she included a concerning note from Francisco. The autopsy report would remain private unless the case became a medical examiner's matter or the Presley family decided to release it. Meanwhile, Harold Sexton, a toxicologist from Baptist Hospital, was working with bioscience laboratories. Dr. Norman Weissman, the director of toxicology, was alarmed by the results from a test that came in under the name Ethel Moore. The test showed 10 types of drugs in significant concentrations. Sexton revealed that the test was actually for Elvis, and they wanted a thorough investigation. Bioscience Laboratory was ahead of its time, using advanced technology called gas chromatography, mass spectrometer, GCMS. This technology could separate and analyze complex mixtures of drugs, producing detailed results. Francisco's lab at the University of Tennessee didn't have this technology. Weissman was stunned by the high concentrations of drugs in Elvis's system. He called Robert H. Cravey, a top toxicologist in Orange County, for a second opinion. Cravey and his assistant, Dwight Reed, ran the tests and confirmed Bioscience's results. Cravey was puzzled by the lack of stomach specimens, which he thought were crucial for a proper investigation. Cravey concluded that the combination of drugs in Elvis's system, ranging from therapeutic to toxic levels, was fatal. He suspected an overdose. Weissman showed the results to Sexton, who then returned to Memphis and shared the findings with his colleagues. They all agreed that the cause of death was clear, an overdose. It was October 17, 1977, 2 months after Elvis's death. On October 18th, a group of doctors and hospital staff gathered at Graceland, Elvis Presley's mansion, to explain the autopsy report to Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. Dr. Donald Muirhead, a respected pathologist, led the meeting. He was joined by Dr. Francisco, Dr. Morris Elliott, the hospital's administrative vice president, Dr. Sexton, a forensic pathologist, and 2 nurses, Marion Koch and Sandy Miller. Notably absent was Dr. Nishapoulos, Elvis's personal physician, who was not invited. Muirhead began by detailing the physical conditions found in Elvis's body. There was minor swelling in the lungs, inflammation around the eyes, and a blue coloration on the lower abdomen, which indicated that Elvis had been in a curled position when he died. Muirhead also noted hundreds of small hemorrhages on Elvis's upper body, suggesting that he had lived for a short time after falling to the floor. All these signs pointed to a drug overdose as the cause of death, which the toxicology report confirmed. Dr. Francisco, who was present, agreed with 90% of Muirhead's findings, but wanted to review the report further before making a final conclusion. He also mentioned that he felt obligated to make a statement to the press later. Morris Elliott, recalling the meeting 2 years later, said that Dr. Muirhead had explained the autopsy process and the results in detail. Francisco, however, wanted to review the report with his team before making an official statement. Beth Tamke, a reporter for the Commercial Appeal, knew about the meeting but didn't have enough details to write a story. She was determined to get the scoop before the Press Scimitar, a rival newspaper. Tamke's boss, E.B. Blackburn, was nervous about covering hard news, especially anything related to Elvis. But Tamke had built strong relationships with pathologists and other sources over the past 2 months. The day after the Graceland meeting, Tamke wrote a story based on her sources, reporting that multiple drugs might have caused Elvis's death. She mentioned that 10 drugs were found in Elvis's system, all within prescribed levels, but their combined effect could have been deadly. The story also noted that Elvis's heart was abnormally large, weighing 520 grams. Francisco was not happy with the story and called a meeting with his staff. He believed that the Baptist Hospital team was trying to influence the final ruling, and that the newspaper article was incorrect. He told Tamke to hold off on writing more stories until his news conference on Friday. Tamke, however, wasn't waiting. She managed to get a hold of the death certificate, which listed the cause of death as a heart ailment, with no mention of drugs. She wrote a story about this, which was published on October 21st. The story revealed that Francisco had signed the certificate the day before, and had it delivered to the local health department. The next day, Francisco held a news conference and announced that the cause of death was hypertensive heart disease, with coronary artery disease as a contributing factor. He stated that drugs played no role in Elvis's death, and that his entire staff agreed with this ruling. Francisco also mentioned that 2 other toxicologists, whose identities were not revealed, supported his conclusions. Tamke, however, had obtained a portion of the toxicology report from Bioscience, a private lab. Her story revealed the presence of high levels of multiple drugs in Elvis's system, including codeine, methaqualone, diazepam, and others. These drugs acting together could have caused death by polypharmacy, or the combined effect of multiple medications. Francisco dismissed the bioscience findings, stating that his own lab's tests were more reliable. This claim was met with skepticism by forensic specialists who knew the reputation of bioscience. In the aftermath of Francisco's news conference, Tamke felt that her hard-earned documentation of Elvis's drug use was being ignored. Her stories were relegated to the shit files in the newspaper's morgue, and the press in Memphis lost the initiative she had established. 2 years later, in the summer of 1979, Beth Tamke was working on consumer complaints at the Commercial Appeal. She thought the Elvis story was dead, and the newspaper's management agreed. They believed that reporting on the drugs in Elvis's system was the end of the assignment. Instead, they focused on other Elvis-related stories, such as lawsuits over the use of his name and image, tax claims, and the solvency of the Presley estate. Vernon Presley, who had managed to keep the estate together, died of heart problems on June 26, 1979. Meanwhile, Charles C. Thompson II, a network television producer, was back in Memphis to work on a story about Elvis with Geraldo Rivera. Thompson, who had once worked at the Commercial Appeal, knew where the newspaper kept stories that were too sensitive to publish. He was determined to uncover the truth about Elvis's death, even if the newspaper wasn't interested anymore. Charlie Thompson landed in Memphis, his hometown, feeling a mix of excitement and anxiety. He had come back to dig into a story that had been nagging at him for a while: the mysterious death of Elvis Presley. 2 years had passed since the king of rock and roll had died, and despite the official report, Thompson was convinced there was more to the story. He first stopped by his brother-in-law Jim Cole's house, a cozy gray stucco bungalow. Jim, who had also worked at the Commercial Appeal, was now a freelance writer. Thompson and Jim had a history. They were fraternity brothers and had even worked together at the newspaper. But Jim was calmer and less confrontational than Charlie, and he wasn't as enthusiastic about reopening the Elvis case. He suggested Charlie look into some of the more outlandish schemes people were using to capitalize on Elvis's legacy, like selling inch-long ceramic tiles from the mausoleum where Elvis and his mother had been buried. But Charlie wasn't interested in those side stories. He wanted to get to the heart of the matter. So, the next morning, he headed to the Shelby County Courthouse. The courthouse was a bustling place, filled with lawyers, clerks, and people with various legal matters to attend to. Charlie made his way to the clerk's office and asked to see Elvis Presley's probated will and estate file. The clerk handed him a thick stack of papers and directed him to a desk where lawyers typically reviewed court documents. Charlie began to sift through the pages, taking notes as he read. On page 6 of the estate's accounting ledger, he found 10 separate notations about a Nishapoulos mortgage note collection. This caught his attention because he knew that Dr. Nishapoulos was Elvis's physician. It seemed unusual for a doctor to be indebted to a patient for a significant amount of money. As he continued to read, he saw multiple notations of large payments over $10,000 going to the medical group's services on tours. This piqued his interest even more, especially since he had been told that the medical group was actually Dr. Nishapoulos's medical partnership. Charlie realized he needed to see more of the file, so he wrote out a check to the probate court clerk to have the entire document copied. While waiting, he decided to explore the circuit court clerk's office, which handled contract disputes. He found a lawsuit filed by Dr. Nishapoulos, Joe Esposito, and Michael McMahon against Elvis for more than $100,000 in damages. The suit claimed that Elvis had reneged on a promise to invest in a racquetball club and to allow the club to use his name for promotion. The case had ended in a quiet settlement, with few details disclosed. Charlie was puzzled. What kind of relationship did this doctor have with his patient anyway? He wondered. He borrows big money from Elvis, gets paid a lot for treating him, and then sues him. Something's not right. He had the lawsuit copied and headed back to the probate court to pick up the other copies. With the documents in hand, Charlie took the elevator to the 3rd floor of the Commercial Appeal building. He asked to speak to Mike Grail, the managing editor who had been there when Charlie had covered the police station years ago. Grail was known for his brusque manner, but Charlie liked him and thought most newsmen took him too seriously. "What the hell you in town for, troublemaker?" Grail teased. "Elvis Presley," Charlie answered. "What killed him?" "His ticker quit," Grail said. "Ticker quit, but why? Were drugs involved?" "Find out for yourself," Grail answered. "You still know your way around the morgue, I guess." Charlie nodded as Grail pointed the way. Charlie made his way to the morgue, a vast room filled with files and archives. The morgue was a treasure trove of information, and Charlie knew he would need to dig deep to find the clues he was looking for. He started by looking up the files on Elvis's death, hoping to find something that had been overlooked or hidden. The morgue was a place where stories were stored, but it was also a place where stories could be buried. Charlie was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it led him. Charlie Thompson had been back in Memphis for only a few days, but he already felt like he was on the edge of something big. Glenn Allen, the old clerk at the newspaper, had retired, and Thompson had to introduce himself to the new guy. He asked to see the Presley files, a collection of about 20 envelopes. Thompson spent the afternoon going through them, but there wasn't much that caught his attention. He wondered if there was a shit file on Elvis, where the really juicy stuff might be, but he didn't feel comfortable asking the new clerk about it. The library was new, but some things hadn't changed, like the green plywood cabinet with the big padlock. That's where the secret files used to be kept, and Glenn Allen had the key. Thompson decided to take a chance. He asked the clerk if there were more files, and the clerk pointed to the green cabinet. But to get in, Thompson needed permission from E.B. Blackburn, the paper's Metro editor. Blackburn was a short, well-dressed man with a bow tie and a flat-top hairstyle. He greeted Thompson and unlocked the cabinet. After a bit of small talk about how much the newspaper had changed since Thompson's time there, Blackburn left, leaving Thompson alone with the files. Thompson started flipping through the material. He found a plain white envelope and opened it. Inside were several lab reports. The first one was from Methodist Hospital and was about a patient named Ethel Moore. She had tested positive for several drugs. The next report was for E.A. Presley, dated August 17, 1977, and showed that Elvis had 6 different drugs in his system. The last report was from a lab in California and contained pages of numbers and symbols, along with a chart showing therapeutic and toxic drug levels. Thompson realized he had stumbled onto something significant. Tamp's secret evidence. Thompson knew he needed to make copies of these reports fast, before they were locked up again. He stuffed them into his shirt and went to find a copy machine. He found one in the promotion department, and the woman who ran the office remembered him. She let him copy about 10 pages, and they chatted for a bit. Back in the morgue, Thompson put the reports back and thanked the clerk before leaving. On his way out, he stopped at Beth Tamke's desk and asked why the newspaper hadn't used the reports. Tamke was surprised and told him he shouldn't have seen them. Thompson could tell she was upset but also intrigued. Next, Thompson headed to Baptist Hospital. He wasn't a chemist, and he needed to understand the lab reports better. He parked his car and asked the receptionist to page an old friend who was now a resident at the hospital and related to one of the doctors who had tried to save Elvis. Thompson's friend met him in the parking lot, and they huddled in the trunk of Thompson's rental car. Thompson showed him the documents and asked for an interpretation. After a few minutes, his friend said, "Well, Jesus H. Christ, it's obvious. The guy died of drugs." Thompson explained that the man was Elvis Presley, and his friend was even more surprised. With this new information, Thompson drove to Jim Cole's house. He burst in, excited and determined. He told Cole about the secret documents and the possibility that the official story about Elvis's death might be wrong. Thompson needed help, and he offered Cole a job with ABC. Cole agreed, and they started planning their investigation. They sat at the dining room table, making notes and lists of names and phone numbers. They had a lot of work to do, and the deadline was fast approaching. Just as they were getting into the groove, the phone rang, It was E.B. Blackburn, the Metro editor. He demanded that Thompson destroy the copies of the toxicology reports. Thompson was taken aback but refused. Blackburn insisted, even tearing up his own copies over the phone. But Thompson stood firm. After hanging up, Thompson called Geraldo Rivera, who was on the West Coast. Thompson figured that striking a nerve with Blackburn was a good sign that the reports were real. The next morning, Thompson sent a copy of the reports to Rivera and picked up Cole. They headed to the library at the University of Tennessee Medical School for a crash course in forensic toxicology. The reports from the California lab showed that Elvis had lethal levels of codeine, Quaaludes, and other drugs in his system. The levels were way above what was considered safe. Thompson and Cole learned that combining these drugs could be extremely dangerous, leading to respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, and death. They also found traces of other drugs, like Valium and Placidil, which were at or above therapeutic levels. Thompson was shocked. He couldn't believe a doctor would prescribe such a dangerous combination of drugs. He wondered how the medical examiner, Jerry Francisco, could have ignored such compelling evidence. Francisco had a reputation for cutting corners and prioritizing politics over science. For example, in the investigation of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, Francisco had failed to thoroughly examine the wound, which left many questions unanswered. Thompson and Cole were determined to get to the bottom of Elvis's death. They knew it would be a tough investigation, but they were ready to follow the story wherever it led. Earlier in his career, Francisco played a big role in a famous trial. He testified against Louis Montesi, a grocery store executive in Memphis who had a history of drinking and getting into trouble. Montesi's wife died from a gunshot wound, and Francisco found skin under her fingernails that matched scratches on Montesi's neck. This made detectives think Montesi was the killer, but they didn't find any fingerprints or the gun used in the shooting. So, the main piece of evidence was the skin sample. However, some experts didn't agree with Francisco. Dr. Milton Halpern, a famous medical examiner from New York, said Francisco's sample was just gunk. Another expert, Dr. Robert Hausman, thought it could be dandruff or even leftover food from the Montesi family's dinner. Because of this, the charges against Montesi were dropped. In the medical examiner's office, Francisco is known for his quick and efficient methods. He rarely does autopsies himself. Instead, he uses a system where he assigns numbers to different parts of the body, and a secretary writes out the detailed descriptions later. This helps him finish autopsies much faster than other pathologists. In court, Francisco is a strong witness. He wears gold-rimmed glasses and keeps his knees together, looking very professional. He's known for sticking to his opinions, even when they're challenged. One time, he testified in a case where a man's death was ruled a heart attack by another pathologist. Francisco said the man died from a blow to the head, and his testimony helped win the case against the insurance company. One day, a reporter named Thompson and a producer named Cole were investigating Elvis Presley's death. They called a lab called Bioscience and set up an interview with the lab director, Dr. Raymond Kelly. Kelly said the lab was very thorough in their analysis of Elvis's drug levels. When asked about criticism from Francisco and others, Kelly said those people just didn't understand how careful the lab was. Thompson and Cole then visited the Shelby County Medical Examiner's office to talk to Francisco about Elvis's autopsy. Francisco gave them a 2-page report and a press release, but said the full autopsy was private and couldn't be shared. Thompson thought this was strange and considered suing Francisco to get the autopsy. At the time, a man named Jim Rout was the coroner of Shelby County. He was a fan of Elvis and wasn't satisfied with the information Francisco gave him. Rout thought about holding an inquest, but decided to ask the county attorney for advice on whether Francisco could keep the autopsy private. Thompson and Cole also met with doctors at Baptist Hospital, who confirmed there was a disagreement between the hospital and Francisco. The hospital wanted to release the autopsy, but was worried about breaking patient confidentiality laws. Thompson decided to sue Francisco, and the doctors were supportive. Thompson then sent the toxicology reports to a doctor named Matthew Ellenhorn in California. Ellenhorn studied the reports and said Elvis died from an overdose of codeine and methaqualone, also known as Quaaludes. He also found that Elvis had taken many other drugs, which together caused his heart and lungs to stop working. Ellenhorn believed Elvis was addicted to these drugs and was using them to cope with a high-stress lifestyle. Thompson and Cole then showed the reports to Dr. Cyril Wecht, a well-known forensic pathologist. Wecht agreed that Elvis died from the combined effects of multiple drugs, which depressed his central nervous system and caused his heart and lungs to fail. These findings added to the growing controversy surrounding Elvis's death, and raised questions about the official cause of death given by Francisco. The case of Elvis Presley's death was a complex and controversial one, filled with many unanswered questions. Dr. Cyril Wecht, a well-known pathologist, had a lot to say about it. He believed that the drugs Elvis was taking played a significant role in his death. Codeine was the main culprit, but there were others too: Valium, a tranquilizer, Valmid and Placidil, both sedatives, phenobarbital and butabarbital, also sedatives. It was a dangerous mix, and the levels of these drugs in Elvis's system were concerning. Wecht didn't think it was a suicide. Instead, he believed it was an accidental death. He pointed out that if one doctor prescribed all these drugs, it was a serious case of poor medical care. If multiple doctors were involved, it showed a lack of communication and diligence, which could be considered negligence. The drugs Elvis was taking had a combined effect called synergism. This means that when you take multiple drugs with similar effects, the overall impact is much stronger than the sum of their individual effects. In Elvis's case, this meant the drugs could have been lethal together, even if they weren't in fatal doses individually. Wecht also criticized Dr. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner who handled the case. Francisco declared Elvis's cause of death as cardiac arrhythmia, a heart condition, even before all the test results were in. This was unusual and raised doubts about the accuracy of the diagnosis. Wecht believed the autopsy should have been conducted at the medical examiner's office, not at the hospital, and that Francisco's handling of the case was questionable. The legal team of Charlie Thompson, Jim Cole, and Mike Pleasance decided to take action. They filed a lawsuit to make Elvis's autopsy report public, believing it was necessary to get to the truth. The lawsuit was a significant step in their quest for answers. To dig deeper, Thompson brought in Danny Goldfarb, a former New York public defender, to help with the investigation. Goldfarb followed up on an anonymous letter that suggested Dr. George Nishapoulos, Elvis's primary doctor, had refused to stop prescribing drugs despite warnings from another doctor, Dr. Lawrence Rubble, who was concerned about Elvis's liver. Goldfarb and Cole also interviewed Marion Koch, Elvis's private nurse. Despite her close relationship with Elvis, Mrs. Koch was reluctant to discuss his drug use. Her book, I Called Him Babe, was a loving tribute to Elvis but avoided the topic of his drug abuse. When questioned, she admitted that Elvis was taking a lot of medication, but insisted it was all prescribed by Dr. Nishapoulos. The interview with Mrs. Koch was frustrating. She was more interested in talking about her family and her chihuahuas, Liz and Honey Bunch, than about Elvis's drug use. Goldfarb, known for his casual style, almost got into trouble when one of the dogs dragged its bottom across his foot. The interview didn't yield much new information, but it reinforced the idea that Elvis's inner circle was protective of his image. In the end, the investigation into Elvis Presley's death revealed a troubling story of excessive drug use and poor medical care. The questions about his death remained, and the legal and medical community continued to debate the true cause. For many, the memory of Elvis remained as a mix of the legendary performer and the tragic figure whose life was cut short by a combination of factors, including the drugs he was taking.